suis heureuse d'ouvrir la première session de la 43e législature du Canada. Your role in the democratic process is a privilege and a responsibility. In this election, parliamentarians received a mandate from the people of Canada, which ministers will carry out. It is a mandate to fight climate change, strengthen the middle class, walk the road of reconciliation, keep Canadians safe and healthy, and position Canada for success in an uncertain world.
That was Governor General Julie Payette delivering this government's throne speech not that long ago. The CBC's David Cochran was listening in alongside me and our colleagues here at the CBC. Let's talk about sort of the top headlines out of this throne speech, divided into sections. A throne speech very much focused on sort of what we can gather from the election, in that it's an electoral calculation. They're reaching out to people on the side of things, on the progressive side of things, that they know that there are some extra votes in.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, this is a progressive-leaning government. They view this as a progressive parliament and a progressive electorate, so they're going to try to make this thing work with a progressive agenda. And right there in the very beginning, the first section of the speech was fighting climate change with the line, "A clear majority of Canadians voted for ambitious climate action now, and that is what the government will deliver." So it is very clear that on that issue, they think they have the opportunity. It is core to their brand and what they campaigned on, but to win support from the Bloc Québécois, where climate is a massive issue in Quebec, to win support from the New Democrats and maybe even from the Greens, even though electorally, and no offense to Elizabeth May and her cadre, they don't quite matter on voting day because they can't save or defeat the government with the small number they have in the House. So there's definitely that play there, and to young voters and the next generation of Canadians, that climate is going to be front and center of this parliament, at least in the rhetoric we've seen on the opening day. The other key thing, too, is this nod to middle-class affordability, which was a big part of the election campaign. Economic anxiety was at the core of what the Conservatives unsuccessfully ran on, but the first act of the government, legislative act, will be legislation to be voted on, presumably next week, to cut taxes for low and middle income Canadians, to raise the basic personal exemption, and to have that in place by January 1st, so at the start of the next tax year. So a climate and tax cut focus with a series of promises sprinkled through to try to win support, though I don't think the reaction from the other parties suggested that they're ready to give up their leverage this early in a minority parliament.
I want to get into that reaction in a second, but first, what struck me was actually the level of specificity in this. Generally, throne speeches are about signaling your intent in the broad strokes, and there were broad strokes, but there were also some specifics where climate is concerned, where reconciliation is concerned, specifying, for example, that they're going to introduce legislation to usher in UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People, within a year. They're going to cut cell phone bills by 25%. Like, these are election promises, but they were specific in the throne speech.
They are specifics, but they're not surprises. Like, if you're looking for new, bold initiatives in this throne speech, they're not there. It's very difficult for a government that is telling the country that after having been reduced to a minority, that it got the message, it intends to listen and intends to cooperate, then sort of go their own way and throw something brand new on the table. So these are all things we have heard before from the Liberals, with an emphasis on some of the issues that the other parties raise. The end point, or the general idea, being common. How to do it is the detail they need to work out to see if this can go ahead. But, you know, a big play there for Jagmeet Singh on pharmacare, and also we are open to exploring dental care, which was a central part of the New Democrat campaign, the only party promising that of the ones competing for top level in the House of Commons. It's right there in the government's throne speech that they are open to this and want to work with it on it. So, look, Singh is not going to, he's already said there's not enough details. You know, we need to see more before we can say whether we're going to work with these guys, but that's holding on to your leverage, because this parliament is going to be all about negotiations.
And Mr. Singh will be on the show a little bit later, so we'll ask him. I'll quickly say, and I want to get into the opposition's reaction now. He tweeted out essentially what you said, that if this throne speech full of empty promises and little action is all the Liberals have to offer, it's not good enough. If they show they're willing to take real actions, we're ready to work with them to deliver the help Canadians need. Let's go over what various political leaders are saying about this. We'll start with, that's Mr. Singh. We'll get into him in a second. But first, Mr. Scheer, the leader of the official opposition. What was his take on this?
Well, to no surprise, Andrew Scheer doesn't like Justin Trudeau's throne speech. I don't think anybody is surprised by this. I mean, look, he's a guy who's fighting to keep his job as leader of the Conservative Party. He's not going to do anything to help Justin Trudeau do his job as the leader of the Liberal Party. Mr. Scheer says that he's going to propose an amendment to the throne speech tomorrow. Trudeau when he is speaking in the House of Commons to give his formal response. And I'm told for the details of what would be in that amendment, look at the things and the priorities he listed when he sat down with Justin Trudeau shortly after the election. Scrapping C-48, the tanker ban, scrapping C-69, the new environmental assessment legislation, things the Liberals will not do. A path forward for a national energy corridor, a center economic position of the Conservatives in this election, a timeline for the completion of the Trans Mountain pipeline. So they want a pipeline commitment with a timeline and specifics baked into this throne speech. So it's two messages there. It's a continuation of the disagreement between Scheer and Trudeau in the election, but also for a guy who's fighting to hold on to his job, these are things that are red meat for the party faithful that he needs to convince he should get a second chance at running against Trudeau.
It'll be interesting to see the details of that amendment and how that factors into the support or lack thereof of the throne speech. We touched on Mr. Singh. He's the NDP. They had really come into this positioning themselves, again, very specifically. We want to see something concrete on pharmacare. It has to be universal, has to be a mention of dental care. We want to see more aggressive targets on climate change. They kind of did get what they wanted, though.
At least rhetorically.
Yes,
I mean, the details and the specifics are something there. Look, the NDP is in this interesting position of there are two obvious choices for Trudeau to navigate with, two partners, the New Democrats and the Bloc Québécois. They're making the point that, yes, we may both be progressive options, but we are the only federalist option that believes in a united Canada, and that is the best and most dignified path forward for Justin Trudeau. Pharmacare, an increase in health transfers, universal single pay pharmacare, by the way, not just pharmacare, and the dropping, the immediate compensation of Indigenous children in that child welfare judgment we've recently had. These are the conditions that Jagmeet Singh has laid out for supporting the government. Those were all mentioned. They were not specifically on the terms that he has outlined. So rhetorically, he's going to keep pushing for this. The reality is, when you lose a third of your seats and you get 16% at the polls and you don't have a lot of money for an election, you're going to have to find a way to make this work, or they're just going to pivot over to the Bloc Québécois and try to navigate something on a Quebec interest.
And we should talk about the Bloc Québécois, because in this parliament, they actually have a large number of seats, and they had also signaled, their leader, Yves-François Blanchet, had signaled early that he probably wasn't going to oppose the throne speech. He did we did an interview with him where he said, I don't want to hear oil and I don't want to hear pipeline.
And
he didn't hear those words.
No, he didn't, but he did hear a promise to get natural resources to market. So that's oil by another term. I mean, they bought a pipeline. They intend to build a pipeline. They had an event in Alberta to celebrate the pipeline. So this is something they intend to do. But Blanchet talked a lot about jurisdiction, because healthcare, Trudeau talks about hiring doctors in the throne speech. He talks about mental health. These are areas of provincial jurisdiction which the Bloc Québécois jealously guards. And Yves-François Blanchet did say something quite interesting in English in his news conference, where he said, it's not so much what is in the speech, it's what we can get out of this government. So Trudeau says this is a starting point for this minority parliament. I think Blanchet considers this speech a starting point for his negotiations with the government for his support.
So on that then, final question, we're looking forward to the next week and a half. The parliament will sit basically until the end of next week. They'll come back then again at the end of January. What do you think we can expect over the next 7 or so days?
We're going to see a lot of chest beating and flexing of muscles that may not be used, because this is a minority parliament where nobody wants an election. 3 things to watch for on the formal agenda. We're going to see legislation to cut middle class taxes next week, coming from Bill Morneau. I am told there will be a fiscal update before Christmas, and on the 16th of December, Canada's finance ministers are going to be in Ottawa for a meeting with Bill Morneau. So while we try to figure out how Parliament is going to go, the spending and money business of the government will continue with all the provinces and territories.
And we know those premiers want some more money for health care.
They do. They want 2.2% more per year.
A lot. All right, thanks, David. Appreciate the update. The CBC's David Cochran.
And while the government takes strong action to fight climate change, it will also work just as hard to get Canadian resources to new markets and offer unwavering support to the hardworking women and men in Canada's natural resources sector, many of whom have faced tough times recently.
I'm joined now by Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. Hi, Minister Freeland. Nice to see you.
Great to be with you,
Thanks
Vashi.
very much for joining us. You have been tasked since becoming Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs with addressing the outcome of the election in Alberta and Saskatchewan, in that the Liberals have no representation there. I've heard the Prime Minister...
And across the country.
Yes, and across the country. But specifically, I want to ask a question about that, where the throne speech it comes into play here, because you have talked about the frustrations that you've heard out there. The Prime Minister has talked about the frustrations that exist there. Yet there isn't a lot in the throne speech that talks about those frustrations. In fact, natural resources is mentioned twice. No mention of pipeline or TMX. Why is that?
Well, let me just say that, I think the core message of the throne speech was that everyone who has been elected to serve in this House, in the seats just behind us, was elected by Canadians to work hard to make their lives and the lives of all Canadians better. And if we all focus on that and look for the areas where we can find common ground, I think the message of the throne speech is there's an awful lot we can get done. When it comes to the question of energy and the environment and how we thread that needle, I think it's really clear that the election told us, in the election, Canadians told us what they want and what they believe. And what the election results show us is a strong majority of Canadians believe that our government, the federal government, needs to act ambitiously to combat climate change. That was one of the results of the election. And the other result of the election was a strong majority of Canadians voted for political parties that believe we need to get our natural resources, very much including oil, to market, and that means getting TMX built. And actually, the throne speech was delivered 2 days after the official opening of the building of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. 2,000 people are at work in Alberta and BC building that pipeline right now.
But no mention of that in the throne speech. That's the substance of my question, essentially. Why wasn't there more in there? There was a ton on climate change, and I take your point. Voters definitely sent the message that they want to see more concrete action on climate change. That was outlined in great specificity in this document, in this speech. But what you plan to do to get those resources to market was not. There was one small sentence.
Well, I think actions speak very loudly, and the fact that the pipeline is being built right now, and I want to thank my colleague Seamus O'Regan for being there in Edmonton with the official announcement of the beginning of building. That is a concrete, meaningful step. And I also want to say, and I think Canadians really get this, balancing these two objectives, which we know a strong majority of Canadians believe we need to do, it's not going to be easy. But it's something that we have to do, and we are going to be successful if we work hard, all of us, to find the areas of common ground and start from there.
Is your government willing to amend Bill C-69 and Bill C-48? It's not in the throne speech, but that is what we continually hear from the politicians representing people in Alberta and Saskatchewan. They want to see changes to those bills. Will there be changes?
So I was in Edmonton and Regina last week, and in Winnipeg and Quebec City this week. I was in Quebec City yesterday. And really, my mission right now is to listen really hard, to hear what Canadians across the country have to say, and to hear what their elected provincial leaders have to say. And I think it's really important, before coming to conclusions and before acting, to listen carefully, listen hard, and then to have a conversation, and that's what we're going to do.
For how long, though, will you be listening and conversing before people in those provinces will see concrete action to address what they're talking about? Because we've talked to the same politicians that you have, and they keep telling us it's great that you are doing that listening. They're happy that you're meeting with them, but they are looking for concrete action.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. It hasn't been that long yet, Vashi. The new cabinet was sworn in on the 20th
you're able to put a timeline
November.
on other
Today
legislation
was
in
the
this
5th
throne speech.
of December. So let's take a little bit of time to listen and to talk. And I also do want to say, really, I've mentioned Seamus O'Regan, who has hit the ground running, is doing a great job. Jonathan Wilkinson, our Minister of the Environment, is already doing great work. And they also need some time to listen and to hear what people are saying before. And then, I do also want to say, what we need to have is a conversation. And that's what we have begun. And we're going to keep going.
I take your point on the timeline. I would only point out in the throne speech, your government was able to attach, for example, on implementing UNDRIP legislation, a 1-year timeline. You said it's specifically in the throne speech, in 1 year, we'll make sure we introduce something.
Our government was clear on the timelines of things that we campaigned on. of things that we promised to Canadians we would do when we were asking for them to support us in the election. And that's absolutely right, because when you say to someone, when you're campaigning, it's a serious thing. And when you make a promise to voters that you'll do something, you need to do your level best to accomplish it. And so the throne speech absolutely and entirely appropriately included commitments by us to do the things we told Canadians we would do, commitments that we believe represent common ground in the country and common ground that we can find in the House. There are other areas where we need to listen and we need to talk. And the other thing I do want to say, Vashi, is we are not going to agree on everything. We are not going to agree on everything in this House of Commons. And we are not going to agree on everything in our conversations with the provinces. And that's okay. There are some strong and strongly differing political views in our country. There should be. We're a democracy. But I think what we can commit to, and what I think is the approach that will give the best possible outcome for Canadians, is to start by looking for common ground and to build on that common ground and see how far we can get. And I think we can get a long way. 2
quick questions before I let you go, because I know your
Sure.
time is limited, and that's on another aspect of your portfolio that you will maintain from the last mandate, and
Okay,
that is
I'm ready.
around NAFTA. Do you think that NAFTA will be ratified in the United States by the end of the year?
I never make predictions about anything, particularly not U.S. politics.
But you don't. What is your level of optimism? I mean, and I ask because you were just there. Jesus Seade was there yesterday, I believe, talking to Ambassador Lighthizer. Like, there is movement, but it's difficult to. I know U.S. politics is hard to read, but what is your sense as someone on the inside? Is this at the finish line?
So you are 100% right, and you are clearly following the story closely, so thank you for that.
It's my job.
Yeah, it is your job, and you do it very well. There is a lot of very hard work being done. I was in Washington on Wednesday. Jesus Seade, the Mexican negotiator, was in Ottawa on Friday. I have been in extremely close touch with Ambassador Lighthizer over the past few days, and also with our Mexican partners. And I do want to say, especially about Ambassador Lighthizer, he faces a negotiation which may be even more difficult than the original NAFTA negotiation right now in trying to get this agreement ratified in the U.S. I think he is doing a terrific job, but it's difficult. It is a real political challenge. And just as we here in Canada, now with a minority parliament, face the challenge of looking for common ground, the Americans right now face a challenge of looking for common ground between Speaker Pelosi and the administration of President Trump. And that is a challenge, and we should be candid about that. They are working hard. We are working very, very closely with them and our Mexican partners, and also in very close collaboration with the Democrats in the House.
The Prime Minister was on video over the last 48 hours or so, kind of venting about President Trump to a number of other world leaders. CNN was reporting today that President Trump was fuming over that. Has that negatively impacted the relationship where NAFTA or anything else is concerned from your perspective?
So that is a great question, and I can tell you absolutely, truly, that, right now, as you said, we are in a very intense phase in working on NAFTA, and that means I am talking to Ambassador Lighthizer a lot. I talked to him at 9:45 last night. I talked to him this morning. I'm going to talk to him again this afternoon, and we are working together, I would say, very effectively. It's a tough challenge the 3 NAFTA countries face, and we have, I would say, a very constructive, very effective working relationship, because you know what? We have understood, Canada and the U.S., that, it is true. Our governments right now have very big political differences. I don't think that is revelatory for anyone for me to say. But we've also understood that Canadians and Americans will be much better off if we can work together on the issues where we have a common interest. And indeed, that our collective prosperity depends on that. And so that is what we are doing.
So
I humbly
the video does nothing?
put forward to you that is what we need to do inside our own country too.
So the video did nothing?
Well, I can speak from my own experience, which, as it happens in the past 48 hours, has been experience of spending a lot of time on the phone with American partners, and we are just focused on getting the job done, which is trying to get to a place where NAFTA can be ratified in the U.S.
Okay. Thank you very much, Minister Freeland. I appreciate your time today, as always.
My pleasure, and I'm sorry that we have to try to answer questions quickly.
That's okay. Your time is limited. I appreciate your time today. Thanks, Minister Freeland.
Too often, Canadians who fall sick suffer twice. Once from becoming ill, and again from financial hardship caused by the cost of their medications. Given this reality, pharmacare is the key missing piece of universal health care in this country. The government will take steps to introduce and implement national pharmacare so that Canadians have the drug coverage they need.
The Liberals launched their minority government with a speech from the throne delivered by Governor General Julie Payette, as you just heard. Ahead of the speech, the NDP had laid out specific commitments it wanted to see in order to support it. I'm joined now by NDP leader Jagmeet Singh to go over whether he heard that in the speech. Hi, Mr. Singh. Nice to see you. So you had outlined a couple of specific things. Primarily, you wanted to hear a commitment to universal pharmacare. You wanted a nod to dental care as well. You wanted more aggressive action on climate change. Yes. And finally, you wanted to see an acknowledgement around the ruling from the Human Rights Tribunal where Indigenous child welfare is concerned. From my listening, you got the pharmacare, the dental care, and the item on compensation at least. Is that enough for you to support this speech?
Well, when it comes down to it, this throne speech is not going to deal with the problems that Canadians face with in a meaningful way. So as it stands, it's not good enough. And one concrete example I can give you is on national pharmacare. The government the Prime Minister has actually kind of gone backwards instead of going forwards. In the campaign, he mentioned universal. In the throne speech, he says national pharmacare and omits entirely the word national, or omits entirely the word universal. In addition, what I asked for the Prime Minister when we sat down and met, I said very clearly, I want you to just publicly accept your own report. The Dr. Hoskins report states that a universal pharmacare should be universal, should be publicly funded, and single payer. That's the best way to do it. To date, the Prime Minister has never committed to following his own report. That to me shows a lack of commitment, and that's one of the problems that I saw. Also with kids, Indigenous kids, I want to see the government stop taking them to court. And they're still taking them to court. They've got time to stop. So I'm not closing the door on supporting this, but as it stands, it's not good enough.
Okay, let me just delve into that for a second before I get you on the specifics of what you
Sure.
did here. What do you mean that you're not closing the door? Are you supporting it? Or are you? I mean, it's not at a vote right now, but say there. I mean, are you planning on introducing something to do with non-confidence, or like where do you specifically sit?
Well, I'm not happy with it right now, and as it stands, it's not good enough. So I'm open to having conversations. Me and the Prime Minister need to chat and find ways for him to confirm some of the things that I'm concerned about. Because right now it sounds like pretty words again without concrete action. On pharmacare, I don't see the commitment to a universal system, a publicly funded system, a single payer system. Even just acknowledging the report would be, to me, a clear step. To me, it seems pretty easy. You ask the government asks for a report to be commissioned, and to date, they talk about pharmacare without ever saying if they accept the findings of the report and say, yes, we want a public, single-payer, universal system. To me, that's problematic.
Is that really the point of a throne speech, though? I mean, he signaled pharmacare is the missing piece, I think was the term that they used. Like, there is an acknowledgement that pharmacare is needed. There is an acknowledgement about more action on climate change. But are we really, I mean, in the history of Canada, we don't normally look to throne speeches to say, okay, policy A, B, C, D, E is going to be enacted at this time.
Well, I want more than just a vague wording, and especially when the wording is weaker than what he said in the campaign. In the campaign, he said universal. Now he's saying national. It's not the same thing. He's used the word national or universal for dental care, and he particularly omitted universal from pharmacare. To me, that's really concerning. The report says very clearly, what Canadians have told me, some folks have some coverage, but their deductibles are thousands of dollars, and they can't actually use that coverage. To them, it's meaningless, but they technically check a box of having coverage. So for me, universal coverage is so key because that's how we save money for provinces. That's how we help out those who are struggling to get access to doctors and to hospitals. If we had a universal system, all the evidence shows that it would save everyone money.
The only thing is, I was at the Premier's the other day, the Premier's conference, and I was actually taken aback at the degree to which those premiers were not wholeheartedly endorsing a universal national system. In fact, a few of them were like, I want nothing to do with it. Most of them were saying, before I'll even consider that, you have to properly and adequately fund the healthcare system as a whole. How do you propose the Prime Minister impose a national system on provinces that don't want one?
Well, I think a couple ways. We know that there's provinces that want one. We know that the Atlantic provinces are absolutely open. BC is open to doing it.
Sort of. The Premier there wasn't wholeheartedly endorsing it too, because he says the system they have works pretty good.
Well, we have to work out some details, but if we provide a system where every single person in BC has coverage for medication, every single person in the Atlantic provinces has coverage for medication, and Ontario says no, well, then the Premier is going to have to go back to the people of Ontario and say why he didn't accept a system that would have covered every single person in the province for no extra money.
They want to be able to opt out with compensation. I know, I apologize.
I was in the middle of my sentence.
Okay, I apologize, but you're not directly answering the question. The Premiers all specifically said that they wanted to be able to opt out with compensation.
And it's not the way to go. I'm saying if you take a Premier and show neighboring provinces or nearby provinces where every single person is covered, and you go to that province, you go to Ontario and say, Ontario residents, you could have completely covered medication, but your Premier is saying no, you wouldn't have to spend a cent more on our program that we're proposing, and every single person would be covered, the Premier would change their tune very quickly. If money was on the table, a plan was on the table, I highly doubt any Premier could turn down money that would ensure that everyone has medication covered, or they would have to go back to the polls with that, and I'm very confident that people would send them a powerful message.
Do you understand, though, or are you sympathetic to Premiers that don't have the highest level of faith in the federal government, regardless of who the party is, the federal government's ability to run such a system? They're saying right now, healthcare generally is not going so great. There's a lot of issues in their own provinces. The feeling I got, at least a few days ago, was that they don't have faith in the federal government to run the kind of system that you're talking about. They also don't believe the feds are going to pick up the whole tab.
Well, they have to make a commitment with the money. I think it really comes down to funding the program. If the funding is there and the funding is legislated and the funding is clear, then this program is going to work. And I can't understand why we're the only country in the world that hasn't been able to figure this out. Every other country that has a universal healthcare system also has a pharmacare system that's national. We can do it. We are a country that's able to do so much. When we started with the path down universal healthcare, there were lots of people that opposed it. Lots of provinces said, no, we can't do it. Now we have it. I agree with the Premiers, though, that the funding has to be better. Federal governments, Liberal and Conservative, have cut funding over the years. What used to be a 50-50 balance is now 25-75, and that's a problem, and we need to address that as well.
Do you think, before I let you go, just final question, that the feds should be picking up the entire bill? That report that you referenced from Eric Hoskins said that it's about $15 billion a year. That's a lot of money. Where would they get it?
Well, $15 billion a year, if you look at some of the priorities, in 1 year alone, the government made a commitment to give $14 billion in corporate tax cuts. So we've got choices that we can make. We also know that if we put in place a super wealth tax on those who've got fortunes of over 20 million, it could raise 70 billion over 10 years. So there are choices we can make to raise the funds to make sure we pay for this. It's a matter of, are we willing to do it? New Democrats are going to fight for this because people need to have better health care. And one of the key steps to achieving that is universal pharmacare.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Mr. Singh. Appreciate your time as always. Right now, sitting next to me is Candice Bergen. She's the Conservatives House Leader. Nice to see you. Thanks so much for being with us, Ms. Bergen.
Thanks, Bashi.
Let me ask you first that Mr. Scheer came out right after the speech and said that he would be introducing an amendment to this speech. Can you tell me anything about the content of that amendment?
Well, you'll have to wait and see it tomorrow. We're still fine-tuning it. We obviously had to see the speech from the throne and see what we thought of it, so we're developing that amendment now. You know, I can tell you overall, we were really hoping, when we saw the Prime Minister say he was going to be listening to Canadians, we saw him meet with some of the premiers over the last couple of weeks, that this speech from the throne would reflect that and reflect what we hoped would be an acknowledgement from him that he needed to make some changes and address some issues that are facing the country. And we didn't see that today in this speech from the throne.
I guess, why do you say that you didn't see it? He did outline, for example, a number of things that his government plans to do to fight climate change. And right after, he said, we'll work just as hard to get our natural resources to market. Why isn't that addressing
Well, he gave it, I think, 2 words in the speech from the throne, but actually didn't lay out any kind of specifics. Things that we have suggested, like a national Energy Corridor, things that the premiers have been talking about, like the terrible effects of Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, the effects of the tanker ban, C-48. None of that was addressed. It was sort of like he listened to them, he smiled, he nodded his head, and then with the speech from the throne, he's saying, I'm not going to do anything differently.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second, because a throne speech is generally a wide swath of sort of a broad way of looking at the intent of the government. The government has signaled, many ministers we've had on the show, including Minister Wilkin, who's in charge of C-48 and C-69, that they are willing to amend it through the implementation, through regulations, right? That they will. They acknowledge that the bill is not what people in Alberta and Saskatchewan or certain segments of that population hoped it was. Why isn't that enough?
Well,
why do you have to have the specifics in this?
First of all, we saw from the last Liberal government, they only had one speech from the throne, so it absolutely lays out what they're going to do and not going to do. This is a very important document, and we can't just dismiss it, it's only a speech from the throne, so it doesn't really matter. And these are
I'm
really...
not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying that it's not usually very specific.
But these are very important and big problems that are facing Canada right now. So there should have been more specifics. And I mean, Vashi, I've heard contradictions. I've heard some ministers say that they're open to amendments to C-69 and implementation. Then I've heard the Prime Minister say, no, we won't be making any changes. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and you can't blame the energy sector for wondering where the Prime Minister really lies on this when it's Trudeau who has said that he wanted to phase out the oil sands in Canada. So really, he says one thing and does something else, and the speech from the throne is not any kind of comfort to the energy sector. And if you're in Alberta, I think it's easy for us sitting here. If you are in Alberta, you are losing your job, your family's out of work, you're not seeing anything coming forward that's going to bring you any hope. This speech from the throne did not provide that hope. I don't think that we can say that doesn't mean something.
I take your point on the people sitting in those provinces, certainly where they are very worried about their jobs. But we have seen the government, for example, anoint Chrystia Freeland, one of their most prominent ministers, in charge of the file of intergovernmental affairs. She has gone to Alberta and Saskatchewan. She has met with the premiers. She has met, and I spoke with the premiers 2 days ago, and they were actually very happy with those meetings.
Exactly.
So is it fair of you and your party to characterize them as turning a deaf ear to those interests when they are making those overtures?
But I think the speech is actually proof of it. If they were listening to these premiers, if Minister Freeland was doing something more than talking and listening is important, why wouldn't they have said in the speech from the throne, and we recognize the challenges that the energy sector are facing, and we're going to take concrete action by, and maybe name 1 or 2 or 3 things that they were going to do. And instead it's, we're going to support them. We've heard a lot of support is an easy word and nothing concrete, and that would then hold them to account. If they actually said they were going to do something, they would be held accountable to do it.
So is that what your amendment is going to focus on? Is it going to talk about oil? Is it going to talk about pipelines? Is that the point of the amendment?
Again, I'm not going to be disclosing here what the amendment is.
Why not?
Because we actually haven't finalized it. We just saw the speech from the throne, so we're going to finalize it. But it's going to focus on uniting Canada, and we want Canadians to know that there is a party that wants and believes that Canada can get through these challenges, but it's going to take real leadership and decisive action.
The government, before I let you go, also outlined some specific things that they're going to do where climate change is concerned. Is your party supportive of what they outlined?
We are supportive of combating and fighting the effects of climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We believe that there has to be a global effort, and that Canada can very much contribute to reducing emissions globally. We don't believe the evidence shows that a carbon tax does that, but we want to offer our solutions and talk more about what our plan entailed, and we want to tell Canadians about our plan.
Do you think your plan entailed enough, though? I mean, the criticism that I've heard from people in Ontario, specifically in your party, was that they heard at the doors that it wasn't enough.
We didn't talk about it enough. We have a very good plan. Not that everybody would agree with it, and for some people, like Liberals, they do want to increase taxes, and that's part of their plan.
They believe that a carbon tax will be effective.
They do. We don't. But I absolutely believe that we need to talk more about our plan, and that's what we're going to do.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ms. Bergen. Really appreciate it.
Well, that was disappointing. Today was an opportunity to show that over the last 6 weeks, Justin Trudeau has learned the lessons of the last election. Canadians sent him to government with the weakest mandate in Canadian history. Nothing about our energy workers in Alberta and Saskatchewan, nothing about our forestry workers in British Columbia.
I'm going to support the speech because I see in that speech many opportunities for us to not to take what is intended to be given because it's not that clear, but to get things, to make some gains for Quebec. And the fact that it is so unclear about oil makes it so that it's hard to vote against something which is not even named.
And yes, we're willing to talk, but after seeing that throne speech, we need to talk because it's not good enough.
The federal government unveiled its priorities for the coming weeks and months. They include everything from addressing climate change to reconciliation to tax cuts and competing for a seat on the UN Security Council. They did all that, of course, through the throne speech, which was delivered not too long ago. What will opposition parties support? What might get their backs up? And how will those priorities affect the length of time this minority government remains in power? It's time for the Power Panel to weigh in. Kelly Kreiderman of the Globe and Mail joins us from Calgary. In Toronto, Melissa Lantzman of Hill and Knowlton, along with former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson. He's now Chief of Government Relations at the University of Toronto. And over in Montreal, David Ertel, former Quebec Liberal Immigration and Environment Minister. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. David, I'm going to start with you. I'm wondering what you took away from this throne speech, what message you think it intended to deliver.
Well, as the same it was for the cabinet, you're seeing here that with this throne speech, Quebec and Ontario are key priorities. You're talking about climate change, tax cuts, middle class, guns being mentioned so prominently, the unfortunate 30th anniversary of the Polytechnique tragedy tomorrow. You're seeing a lot of detailed measures that are basically, they sound more like an election platform. And just like the cabinet was steered towards Quebec and Ontario, the climate change issue, not naming, not even mentioning by name Trans Mountain, sends a clear message that this government is in full re-election mode and geared towards getting those 13 missing seats for a majority from Quebec and Ontario. And so that's a clear message. And the detail, the level of detail, Vashi, what's interesting about that is that the next big step is going to be the budget. And we're going to be able to follow in the budget all these core engagements that we saw today in this speech.
Melissa, what do you think? How political was this speech?
Well, I think it was a continuation, certainly, of their platform. They had an election platform. This is very much it, and it gives Justin Trudeau the opportunity to move the Liberal Party further to the left, to appease the parties that he needs support from, with some measures that weren't necessarily in his platform. In terms of the standouts here, I think you heard Jagmeet Singh. It was very careful language, gymnastics around what to put in there and what to not put in there. And if you're somebody from the West, you heard after the campaign that we were going to focus on national unity, that we were going to reach out to the West, and that's just not in there. So it remains to be seen who supports it and why, but you certainly see that kind an amendment from Andrew Scheer looking at that Western question.
Andrew, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to agree with David on this. I think this is a throne speech actually not designed necessarily for Parliament. It's really designed to figure out how to win voters back. And there's a couple of key constituencies here that obviously the Prime Minister has zeroed in on, that he thinks that he can get back. Certainly progressive voters in Quebec. Younger voters, there's quite a bit in this throne speech talking about concerns of younger voters and students. And then also what's going to happen in terms of some of those urban concerns, which are sitting within the large vote-rich areas of Ontario and Montreal and Vancouver. And I think that that's really what you're seeing here is that they've made a calculation that none of the opposition parties dare go to an election. As much as they may want to stomp at their feet and bang their fists and signal that that's where they're prepared to go, the simple fact is they aren't. So he's providing enough of a path to move the parties forward, to be able to get the left-wing parties' support. But he's very much trying to speak, I think, to the voters directly.
Kelly, Melissa touched on it. We've heard from opposition leaders as well, particularly Andrew Scheer, talking about how national unity was such a theme that emerged from the outcome of the election. We've seen a lot of outreach on the part of both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister where those voices are concerned, yet there was no real mention of pipeline or oil or anything like that in this throne speech. Instead, there was a very concrete mention that basically dovetailed off of talk on climate change and said we will work as hard to get natural resources to market. How do you anticipate it'll be received where you are?
I think this throne speech clearly shows the divisions in the country again. As other members of the panel have highlighted, this seems like a throne speech that's designed for progressive voters in central Canada. There was a brief mention of getting resources to markets and supporting energy workers, but I think that the throne speech and the emphasis of the throne speech gives Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives a lot of room to criticize, a lot of room to say that there is not a focus on unity, as the Prime Minister has said he would be focused on. I also think this gives the premiers a lot of leverage to speak for Canadians outside of those areas, to speak still on energy laws that are unpopular, to speak on getting some kind of federal program dollars to Alberta and Saskatchewan to help in an economic downturn. I think this throne speech sets a tone that gives Andrew Scheer a platform and a lot to criticize.
It's interesting, David, because a few days ago I was with the premiers when they were holding their big meeting, and it's like the temperature had been dialed way down. In fact, Jason Kenney came on the show and he was thanking people in Ontario and Quebec and the premiers from those provinces for the kinds of overtures that they made in those meetings. I have a feeling that today's speech will maybe have the opposite effect. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, again, it's possible, but at the same time, I think the provinces know that if they go to the federal government divided, they're playing Justin Trudeau's game. Mm-hmm. And they won't be able to get those key components. Like, for example, one of the cornerstones of today's speech is pharmacare. Now, a lot of provinces, including Quebec, are going to want the money or more investment in actual healthcare rather than pharmacare. So here on that key issue, provincial premiers have to stay united, because if they're divided too much, and this doesn't preclude the Western Province premiers from fighting for more from the federal government in terms of oil and gas development, but at the same time, they have to toe that line and present a united front, especially on healthcare, which is a huge provincial issue right now and key. And it's top of the list, both provincially and federally across the country.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Melissa, we just heard Jagmeet Singh a few minutes ago talk about how he wanted, I guess, more specifics on pharmacare. He wanted to hear a commitment to universality and also some sort of funding commitment as well. But at the same time, I mean, the premiers did say that they wanted the ability to opt out of it with compensation. It's not like they're all united on the desire for it either.
No, it doesn't seem like they're united on anything other than the health transfers when it comes to this. On the pharmacare, again, the careful language around a national pharmacare, which moves away from the language used in the past on universal pharmacare. So that's what Jagmeet Singh is watching. I want to go back to the point on the West and why this could be actually a problem for Andrew Scheer, and I think it is a sort of a politically motivated speech and a really careful calculation. And I think for Mr. Scheer, he needs to make this much more about national unity than necessarily sort of pipelines or oil and gas or that single issue, because it does exactly what he did at the beginning election. It relegates him to speaking only for the West. So he's got to say something about the GTA. He's got to say something about Quebec tomorrow and not make this entirely about TMX.
That's a really interesting point. And Andrew, they're supposed to introduce some kind of amendment. I had Candice Bergen on, the House Leader. She had no details about it. I asked, is it going to say oil? Is it going to say pipeline? And she said that they were still putting it together. But what do you think about what Melissa said?
Well, I agree. I think that in many ways this is a pretty smart throne speech in terms of how it's setting the other parties up to essentially play characters from central casting. We've got Andrew Scheer and Jason Kenney stuck in their cowboy hats out west, dreaming of oil wells and pipelines. with no real concern as to what that looks like for the rest of the country. They have clearly set themselves as a regional voice only, abdicating the rest of the space within the country to the Liberals. In Quebec, from what we have seen, at least from what the Bloc leader is saying, he's pretty much morally agnostic in terms of what's there as long as he gets a deal, which I think the Liberals will be able to come in and kind of play the, look, we've got this national unity piece, we're all stronger together. And Jagmeet Singh, I think what the Prime Minister is going to attempt to do is say, look, a lot of good ideas there, but he's going to eventually try to portray him just as Tories are portraying Corbyn in the UK as being very radical, very big budget, very old-fashioned in the approach, and just not something the country can afford. So I think as this plays out, what we've seen is that all of the traps have been set by the Liberals. We're just about to see who steps into them.
Kelly, what do you think?
Well, I think, Melissa makes a good point about the focus not being too much on oil and gas or pipelines, some issues that don't necessarily resonate with the rest of the country. But where Andrew Scheer has room to step in, I think as going forward, talking about middle-class tax cuts, what form those take, talking about, the fiscal anchor for Ottawa, and, we could have a fiscal update coming shortly. Where is the Liberal government's plan on its finances, on, concerns about the global economy coming forward? Some of those issues, as the months progress, could really resonate with voters. And I don't think that this throne speech addresses those concerns in a major way. We know the line items are climate change, Indigenous reconciliation, and gun control. But I think, where there is room for the Conservatives to move in and talk about other things are on the economic front.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.